Let's have a look at the topic we've got tonight: Port Arthur, Deceit and Terrorism. You know, it seems that any alternative viewpoint on Port Arthur is forbidden in Australia by those that would be our masters. You're simply not supposed to talk about it. You're certainly not supposed to hear what's being said. And that's why we get the dissent, that's why we get the censorship, that's why we get an attack on those who would give another viewpoint. Today we've got two speakers speaking on the same topic: Port Arthur, deceit and terrorism. When Wendy Skerr first heard shots at Port Arthur, she ran towards the Broad Arrow Cafe. She heard something whistle past ahead and stopped and ran into another building, the centre, and phoned the police. She had some difficulty getting across the viewpoints of police that there was trouble at Port Arthur on that tragic Sunday. She was the first staff member to enter the Broad Arrow Cafe, and she's received many commendations for what she did on that day. Now, Wendy's been a Tasmanian all her life, visited the mainland a few times, and we're pleased to have her here tonight. For 20 years she's been a member of St John Ambulance Brigade. Her role was firstly to teach others about first aid, to also look after the many first aid kits that are on the Port Arthur historical site. And if she wasn't teaching, she was working as a tour guide. And that was what she was doing on that Sunday. Wendy's going to share with us a little of the history of Port Arthur and also the location. And she said this is an important point. And then she's going to tell us what she experienced on that Sunday, her own experiences. Ladies and gentlemen, to welcome our first speaker for the new millennium at the Inverell Forum 2001, let's give a welcome to Wendy Skerr.
I would like to thank the people of Inverell and the Forum Committee for inviting me here tonight to speak. If it hadn't have been for these people, I guess my story would never have been told. Thinking Australians are not fools. They simply don't know the half of it. John Howard said it would be too hurtful for the victims and their families to have a coronial inquiry, as did the Tasmanian Attorney General Ray Groom. We're still waiting for that coronial inquiry. Without finality, how can we be expected to continue our lives? I'm just going to give you a little history and just show you on the map exactly where Port Arthur is. Port Arthur was settled in 1830 and it closed in 1877. And it was once Australia's largest industrial town. They made everything there from ships to nails. There was approximately 12,700 convicts went through there over that period, and many boys. There were many young boys transported from England. I will talk about communication. Communication with the outside world in the 1830s, using a semaphore system, enabled a message to be sent to Hobart Town and the message returned within 15 minutes. If a phone wasn't available on the day of the massacre, I hate to think what would have happened. All other forms of communication with the outside world were hopeless. Two-way radios, mobile phones. They did it better in the convict days. And I'm just going to walk over here and just show you where Port Arthur is, and Andrew will also be using this map. This is Port Arthur, and this is where Seascape was. This is where Turana was. We're talking about this quite a bit. And this is Eagle Hawk Neck. And this is the only way you can get onto the Tasman Peninsula. So you can see why they chose this area as a penal or a prison because it was surrounded by water, and it would be an island only for this little neck of land, which is only probably 200 metres wide. And then we've got this other peninsula, and this is the Forestier Peninsula. And up here we have a bridge that just, when it's open, completely shuts that off too. So you've got actually the Forestier and the Tasman Peninsula. I would also like to point out the coal mines. And I would like you to see where they are in relation to Hobart. Now on Mount Wellington in Hobart, there is a tower that actually transmits all the communications. And the coal mines out here would have been the only place where the perpetrators of this massacre would have planned to leave a heroin haul, as they called it. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the Tasman Peninsula's southeast of Hobart. Travelling time from Hobart is 1.5 hours. That's travelling at the speed limit. The road is not very good, it's rather windy and quite narrow. My day at Port Arthur started on the 28th of April 1996. It is my own story. My life stopped that day. To best describe the feeling, it would be to say it's just like a tattoo on your brain. I feel like taking the top off my head and scrubbing until all my memory is removed. But it won't go. I only think about it every 10 minutes now. For the first 2 years it was all the time. I left the ferry at about 1:10 p.m. When I reached the outside balcony of the cafe, I noticed a young man with blonde hair staring at me. He would have known I was a staff member as we always wore a navy uniform with a name tag. As I walked by, I nodded at him, he nodded back, and I went into the cafe to buy lunch. I went to where the staff could purchase their lunch without getting hurled up and walked out of the side door, and I went to the information centre. It was then about 1:20 p.m. Okay, this is the Broad Arrow Cafe, and there's a lot of bush up behind these cars. It's important you remember that. I'll just walk across here now. The side door of the cafe was about here. That's where I was. So that was called the information centre. Along here there is a little gap where some people could have got out of the building and escaped, but that's to come a little bit later. Down here, the bodies are still there. There's a couple here, another one here. That was the next day. I went to the toilet, as all good guides used to do, and returned to the information office and sat down for lunch. Often I did eat in the Broad Arrow, but that day, fortunately for me, it was busy. We had about 500 people there. And so I didn't sit down in there and have lunch. The shooting itself started at about 1:30. I say about because the 1:30 walking tour hadn't gone. If the guides didn't leave on time, they'd find they have no time to have 5-minute break when they came back before they'd have to take the next one. So the walking tours always went on time, and it hadn't gone, they hadn't even split the group up, so it was definitely before 1:30. And that is often disputed. I heard the sound of very, very loud bangs, and I never thought of a gun. I thought of it as possibly a gas explosion or anything but. I ran towards the cafe, and I was about 6 inches in from the side of this, you might be able to do that from this point where I was, sorry. About 6 feet from the side of the cafe, and I felt something fly by my head. Had no idea it was a bullet. Still wasn't thinking, actually. I thought I was having a brawl in there. I thought, well, I'm not going in there, lucky for me. And then a person came down the steps to the front of the Broad Arrow, and he wasn't touching the steps. He was going over them. He was flying. And he was warning us to run. Well, out in front of the information centre, we had about 70 people waiting to go on this tour. There was a bus load of elderly Americans, and they sort of didn't want to leave. They thought, gee, they do it well down here, you know. They really put on a show down here. In fact, I've lost sound. No, A little bit early in... right? A little bit earlier in the day, one of the tours had been going up to the Commandant's cottage, and just as the shooting started, there was a girl taking a tour away from there, and that's over the bay from the Broad Arrow, right opposite. And when the shooter started to fire shots across their way, she went down on the ground, flat out on the tummy, with the Navy uniform on, and the American said, "Gee, they can't do that well." And it wasn't long. So I got the warning to run, and I just froze. And he said that the people were being shot, so I just froze to the spot. And I don't know how long I stood there actually. Might have been a minute. But I thought, well, I've got to get in there, but I can't go in there yet. So I ran away towards where they were trying to shift the elderly tourists. And then I thought, God, if we don't let the police know, we're all going to be butchered. So I went back into the information centre, and you all can see where that is. And when I got in there, Sue Burgess and Stephen Howard were in there, and they weren't phoning the police, but what they were doing was very good. They were phoning around the display houses and up to the toll booth and warning them to not let any more cars in, to get the people in the area and get as many people locked up in those houses as they could. And so I ran in and I rang the police. It was 1:32 p.m. exactly, and that has been recorded. I had a little trouble convincing the police officer, naturally. He wouldn't be able to believe what I was telling him, not at Port Arthur. But in the end he said, "Be careful," so I knew he believed me. I'd decided where I was going, the other two hadn't. So I just said, "Follow me, I know where to go." And then Sue, being Sue, who was always very conscientious, she said, "What about the money?" Well, I used the F word, the money. One of them had grabbed a two-way radio. I hadn't thought of that, and so we ran. And just as we came out of the cafe, he came onto the balcony of the Broad Arrow, and he started firing shots. I've been told that he actually was firing at us, but he mustn't have been trying to kill us. I think he was just going over our heads. But the man that saved us was a gentleman at the penitentiary on a cherry picker, and he had it right up in the air, working on the brickwork. Anyway, he decided he'd better get out of there, and he started the motor up. And then he started having a go at him as he lowered it down. So we got around the toilets, and up behind the Broad Arrow there's a lot of bush, and there's a bit of clear space. So we ran up the hill, and when we couldn't hear him shooting, we dived into the bush. Then we'd run again when he was shooting, because we could tell where he actually was, and when he wasn't shooting, we jumped in the bush again and laid flat. We did this 3 or 4 times, and then we heard shooting up the road. That would have been, the first shots would have been when he killed the Mikacs. Then it seemed to be getting further and further away. And then we got up behind the cafe, and we found a young lady who was working in the cafe, and she was just so traumatised and frightened. She was just standing there. As we walked down the hill to go into the cafe, we took the young girl with us, and I knew we wouldn't be able to take her in there, but we found a man that appeared to us to be shot with a shotgun. He seemed to have pellets all over him, but I've been told since it wasn't a shotgun. I don't know. Finally, another man who'd been shot in the head, and he had a piece of dirty rag over it. He said, "Do you want to have a look at it?" I said, "No, leave the rag there." He said, "I don't know whether the bullet's gone through my brain or whether it's just, you know, creased the skull." So that was nothing to what I was to find later. So we got these 2 men and got the young girl and got her to hide them. Now, about this time, we got a message from Ian Kingston, one of the car parkers on the day, and he said, "The vehicle's abandoned, it's still here, but we don't know where he is." So I was frightened, and I think that was the stage I peed myself. I was panicking, I was so frightened. I also knew what I was going to have to face in the Broad Arrow, and having been on an ambulance for years, I've seen what gun can do. So I told the girl from the Broad Arrow to take the men and hide them. Get with them and take them further into the bush and hide them. I said, we know where you are. We'll know. Someone will come and get you. Just stay there. Sue and I climbed down the hill to the back of the cafe and Stephen joined us. Then Sue said to me, I wonder if the girls got out. And I said, what girls? They said, Nicole and Liz. I said, oh God, no. Are they at work? And she said, yes. Now, Nicole and Liz were, Nicole was Stephen's wife. Nicole was Sue's daughter, and Liz was Stephen's wife. They'd been married at Port Arthur only 3 years before. Nicole was 17, Liz was 25, and she'd only worked at Port Arthur for 2 weeks. And I'm thinking to myself, how do I cope with this if there's anything wrong? So Andrew, I think, put an OHP up in the cafe. I took some very deep breaths and I entered the cafe. Had to put on a brave front. There were bodies and body parts everywhere, even on the ceiling, sliding down the walls. Blood and bodies everywhere. The smell of warm blood. I knew I had to look for the girls. I had to go to the gift shop area. And both these girls were lying behind the counter of the gift shop and both were dead. I thought, how am I going to cope for this? So, I knew as soon as I looked at them they were gone, because there was a huge blood loss. And so I put on an act and I got down and made out I was feeling for their pulses, because they were saying, can you do anything? And I just didn't know what to say. I knew they were dead and I just didn't know what to say. I just said, they're both dead. I'm so sorry. There was silence for a couple of minutes. I couldn't look at Sue and Stephen. I just couldn't look. I just couldn't look at their faces. They were so brave, in a terrible position. I asked them to leave and go out and help the others. They both did. Actually, Sue was in charge on the day. They put on a brave face and nobody out there would have known what a terrible fate their girls had suffered. They continued to look after the visitors as they steadily returned to the front of the information centre. Both Sue and Stephen were highly trained in first aid because I'd trained them. This is what I had trained for myself, but never at this magnitude. When you join the emergency services, you don't expect it to be easy. I'd experienced many tragedies, but never a war zone like this. No one could be trained for this. I started to look for survivors in there, and there was only 3 left alive. The 2 men I'd found on the hill outside they'd got out, but that's actually where they were shot. I'll talk about the first person I found alive. His name was Graham Collier. He was shot in the neck. He was choking on his own blood. He was on his side. I could do nothing for him. A man's voice said, his mouth is so full of blood. I said, just put your fingers in his mouth and scoop it out. This was Dennis Gabberty, a Victorian policeman. He sat with Graham while I searched for more casualties. I found out much later that Lynn, a nurse from Victoria, and you've probably read about Lynn, had gone into the cafe before me, and she'd put Graham in the side position and had actually sucked the blood from his airway with a drinking straw. Graham had his neck artery, or his carotid artery, partly clipped. He stayed conscious, and he found out that if he was able to kink his neck in a certain way, it slowed the bleeding. The bullet also grazed his cervical spine, and that's this area. The first one down the back of your neck. And because it grazed his spine, it did something to the spinal cord, so he suffered quite a bit of paralysis even at that time. I had been trained in triage, and I knew that I had to limit the time that I could spend with Graham because I was going to lose other people, and I'd actually triaged him out of it. I'd left him to die, and I've got to live with that. But he didn't die. He lived. Graham was able to watch the gunman as he killed and wounded several people. Just before the gunman left the cafe, he was playing dead while the gunman stepped over and around him. Graham did survive that day. His life since has been similar to all of us mentally, but he suffers a lot of pain. Carolyn Lawton, she's the one that's in the new idea this week. She was travelling with Graham. and her 15-year-old daughter Sarah. She was starting to make a lot of noise. She was absolutely petrified and she would have been in agony. She was shot from the front, about here, and the bullet went straight through and put a 5 centimetre hole in the shoulder blade. It just went straight out. I asked her to be quiet because she kept screaming, and I was so frightened. I said, he's going to come back in. If he knows he left anyone alive, he's going to come back in. So I was petrified. We still didn't know if he'd be back or not. And once again, very firmly, I had to say, be very quiet. She said, have you seen Sarah? Sarah was a 15-year-old daughter. She said she's got a black hat on. And only a few feet away I had saw Sarah. She was killed instantly and with a terrible head wound. I couldn't tell Caroline the truth. Sarah was only 15 years old, and I think if I'd have told her then, Caroline wouldn't have lived. In fact, I wish now I probably had her, because I don't think she wants to live. A man came with some tea towels and helped me try to stem Caroline's bleeding and to keep her calmer down. I then went to look for more alive. Rob Elliott was shot in the back of the head. His left arm was severely injured by a bullet, and his wife was with him. He was in absolute agony, but she had controlled the bleeding and was trying to comfort him. Rod had tried to jump the gunman. A lot of people say, why didn't they jump him? Well, Rob did, and that's what happened to him. I then moved around the cafe looking for more alive. There were none. When I arrived at the only outside door in the gift shop, I found 5 dead, a total of 7, including my 2 workmates behind the counter of this gift shop. I'll go to the map. When I walked into this area here, I found all these dead. In fact, these 3 were piled up on top of one another. They were all dead, and that was the only outside exit door to that part of that building. This was glass, and that door was glass. There was no windows in here, and just up here there was bush. These 2 girls, there's 2 staff members, this is the counter. They knew that door wouldn't open. It was broken. And they hid there. But had that door have opened, those 2 girls would have led those people to safety. We call this a Hessian screen here because 3 ladies were hiding in behind there. 2 of their husbands had pushed them in there. And and there was another lady with them as well. Now, they, I believe, was nearly last killed in that cafe. And because this was the only other exit, and that was past the gunman who was working in here, and through the front door here, it's only natural they're not going to try to go through there. And this was a long table here, and several people hid under the tablecloth there. It went nearly to the floor. But I never could get that scene out of my mind, because I tried to open that door and it wouldn't open. I wanted to get one of the men out from underneath to have a look at him, and I left him. I never had a look at him. I panicked. And I don't know, to this day, whether he was still alive. But I have been assured by the doctors that everybody died instantly. It would have been at just about 2 o'clock by then. I walked quickly. I've lost a page. Here we are. I walked quickly to get to the phone in the office of the cafe, because in my training we'd been always told, if you've got a mass casualty situation, to please let the ambulance service know what you need. So I knew I had to go and do that. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw 2 Asian people sitting on their chairs, one holding a knife and the other with her finger through the cup of a cappuccino, and they had been shot straight through here. They hadn't known what hit them. It was so sudden. As I was moving to the office to phone the ambulance service, I trod on something. It seemed to crack under my feet. It was the skull of a young woman. She'd had the top blown off her head, and to my horror, when I looked down, her brain was lying in a bowl of chips. It had fell out of her head and as she fell to the floor and went into the bowl. I thought to myself then, I can't take much more of this. I covered the bowl with a tea towel. I finally arrived in the office. With the phone in front of me, I dialed the ambulance station in Hobart. Peter Morgan, whom I know, was in the control room that day. He answered the phone. It was so good to hear from someone who I knew immediately would have the situation under control. I must have been babbling a bit because he had to calm me down. He asked me how many were dead. I didn't really know. I hadn't done a count. He said, how many can you see from where you're standing? I counted about 12. And he said, what do you need? I said, everything you've got. I need all the ambulances you can find, helicopters, and I said, I need the police. It was just about then that Paul Cooper, another guide, he'd just finished his advanced first aid training, and he came in to me and he said, I've got too much to do, I can't help you in here. He said, I've got them at the buses, because the gunman had been to the buses. But there was a nursing sister there, her name was Robin, and so she assisted Paul at the buses. The local ambulance rang shortly after I'd contacted Hobart. They were outside, they weren't allowed to come in until they got the all clear. And I felt really happy to see them, but I didn't realise when they arrived that they'd witnessed the carnage on their way in. Firstly, the toll booth area with 4 dead and the covered bodies of the Mikacs. We now had oxygen and some suction equipment and some IV fluids, thank God. Steve Ireland asked me, and he was the local doctor down there, to go and find as many wounded as possible and take a note of their names and their addresses and list their injuries. So I had to start going around again and looking for wounded, and it was all horrible, you just couldn't get away from it. I was never so pleased though to be relieved in that cafe. I went to the cottage next door and I found a man there and his wife, and they were petrified, and he'd had the side blown off his face and he had a bit of dirty rag on it, and he wanted me to have a look at it. I said, no, I don't want to see it, it's not bleeding, leave it. They were worried he might come back. I said, well, the veranda's partly covered in, just stay there. They were started to look at me a little bit strangely, and I must have looked awful because I had blood all over my legs. I put my fingers through my hair, and on the backs of my fingers, as I did this, I had body matter all over them. It just fell off the roof on top of me. My shoulders, my hair was spattered. I must say at this point, there were many visitors, bus drivers and staff, who all exposed themselves to that horrific scene to help out. Without their help, I'm sure the death toll would have been much higher. There was also a man making cups of tea, believe it or not, going in and out, stepping over the bodies and distributing the cups of tea around. By this time, it was nearly 2:30, the Dunalley ambulance arrived, and that's where the bridge is. But I'll leave that for Andrew to tell you about. And on board we had a paramedic. Back outside I found more casualties. Young Bridget Cook, a staff member, had been shot in the leg, and she'd tied her apron round, and she said, don't you think I've done a good job? She said, I remembered what you taught me in first aid. And I said, yes, you have, but your leg's going a little bit blue. I think we've got to do something about it. So the doctor had a look at her, and we decided to release the tourniquet a bit and just loosened it. By this time, people began to come out of hiding. There was more ambulances arrived from Hobart, no police yet. Only the ones that came in the helicopters, because there was always a policeman in there. I can remember one of those police officers on the helicopter going to the phone, and he rang police headquarters and he said, get some effing police down here. There was nothing they could do as they were unarmed and were required to leave with the helicopter. We still didn't know where the gunman was. I was now asking myself, where were the police? It was now about 3:30 p.m, 2 hours since I'd called them, and it should have only taken 1.25 hours for a police car. I know if an ambulance can arrive from Hobart, the police should be able to do it even quicker. Visitors had evidently observed me going in and out of the cafe. They would also note that I was a staff member, once again because of my uniform and name tag. I remember a lady came to me, she was so upset. She said her husband was dead in the cafe. She had no car keys or money, it was all in his pocket of his trousers. She was so desperate, she wanted me to go and collect it from her husband's body. I explained to her that was the police's work and I was sorry. But they hadn't arrived yet. I just started to feel embarrassed about it. I then had a request from a man, similar. He wanted his wife's handbag. She was dead in the cafe. And I thought, this is getting out of hand. Where are the bloody police? Just after 2 episodes, a lady told me she couldn't find her sister. She asked me if I'd seen a lady in there with black hair, green trousers, white trousers and a green shirt. I walked back in, she was there and she was dead. I went outside, I told the lady that I believed it was her sister in the cafe who had been shot dead. The only way she could identify her immediately would be to have a look for herself. I advised her not to. I said, the police will be here shortly. They hadn't come. And you can ask them what to do. I never did find out if that lady went in. Even those who had witnessed nothing were traumatised from the shock of the event. The policeman was, oh, he'd arrived, that's right, one got there at 4:30. Sorry, I hadn't told you that. And they dropped him in at 4:25 and they drove out at 4:30. He just dropped one off. And he was there, and all he was doing was able to collect names and addresses. He wasn't armed, and I really did feel sorry for him. We still had, you know, probably about 400 people there. We had counted 32 dead bodies and we had about 19 injured. The situation was still so hopeless and we were helpless. Eventually the hotel sent an invitation down for the survivors to go to warmth and have a cup of coffee and something to eat. The policeman installed himself in the hotel and went on collecting names and addresses. Then Walter Micat came to me. I had no idea what he wanted. I felt sick to the stomach when he asked me if I had seen Nanette and his daughters. I thought they would have been home by now. He told me he'd found her car still at Port Arthur. But they weren't home. I couldn't answer that question, as I know he probably would have asked me to go and look, because I'd been told there was a woman and 2 children dead up the road, but I hadn't gone up to look because I couldn't have stood that. We were very busy, and at about 5:30 we were taking the next of kin to a cottage where the CEO lived during the week. Staff were there lighting fires to receive these people. They were all so sad, and we took 2 little van loads up. So they were looked after there by the staff. And the CEO, he'd come back from the East Coast. The staff were sent away to the East Coast, the management, at 11 o'clock that morning to stay overnight. And my supervisor, Robin Cooper, said that had never happened in the 18 years that she worked at Port Arthur. But they left at 11 o'clock and they were staying overnight. When they got word, they came back very quickly. They were back before the police came, but anyway, the CEO, he was wrapped. He said, we're going to get some SOGs in soon, and they're coming in by helicopter. I was to find out later that a helicopter held only 2 young police women off the beat from Hobart. It is now 4 hours after the shooting, and we had about 5 police that we knew of, and we're still in a hopeless situation. The CEO approached me about 6 o'clock. I had to go to the hotel because there was a lot of people up there and they're starting to get sick. But the first thing I found was a young man up there with a bullet grazed atop the cross of his head. He was the fiancé of the girl who'd lost the skull. He was sitting in a chair swaying. I asked why he had not accompanied the walking wounded on a coach to Hobart. He said his fiancée was dead in the cafe and he still had not had the courage to ring her parents in Western Australia. He said he didn't know how he could do it. I was thinking those police should be doing this. I had to find a room for him. He was put on the bed and was accompanied by friends with whom they had seen travelling. A lady came up to me and told me how the gunman in the cafe had shot her husband, his brother, a friend, and left her alive to watch. It was 6:30 p.m. when a warning came from the policeman in the hotel. We're still taking down names and addresses, that there was trouble outside. I later found that the staff at a house called Cloffer, just in front of the hotel, it's used as an administration building. 5 of the staff was out on the veranda having a cigarette when 3 shots were fired right in front of them. We don't know who fired these shots. We don't know why. But they were taken back into that house. They had the lights turned out. Walter was screaming because he just found his wife and children. We had people that were traumatised the first time being traumatised the second time. We had staff that had come in to help being traumatised totally. We saw a news broadcast on television at the hotel. They said the gunman was surrounded at Seascape. So who was it? Had he escaped, or was it someone else? These shots were also heard by the CEO, and he had instructed many staff and visitors in there to stay lying on the floor and keep the lights turned off. Up in the hotel, we couldn't turn the lights off. There's 200 people up there. We had a couple having chest pains. We were just getting into the hotel room, and it was I just couldn't turn the lights off. I just couldn't tell them because they would have been again traumatised. The matron of the nursing home at Newbeen, Sandra Carmichael, arrived at the hotel to help me. We were continually finding all these people unwell, and we were filling up one bed after another, and I just said, where are these ambulance people? But they were down at the Broad Arrow and everywhere trying to look after the crime scene. Just after 7:30, in they come. Police from everywhere. They were heavily armed. They escorted the group from Clopper to the backpackers hostel next to the hotel. Police also came in and was assisting our lonely policeman, who did a wonderful job. Several trauma counsellors walked in from Hobart. They were treating us like children. I'll never forget these people. They had no compassion. I know a lot of the visitors obeyed, some had no option. I have no idea what happened to these people. We sat down for a while, totally dazed and traumatised, and all of a sudden we had more to do, but this wasn't to last long. Some men who had arrived with the coroner weren't very well, and they was up at in the bar, and they were crying. They couldn't stand what they'd seen. My day finished at 1 a.m. on Sunday the 29th of April. I went home to my husband, and I fell into his arms, and I cried and I cried. I quietened down and I decided to wash myself. I showered and showered. When I started to dry my feet, there was deep cuts in it, in the top of my right foot. I didn't think at the time, but a few days later it dawned on me that I should have tests for Hep A, Hep B and HIV. Normally this would have worried me, as I had a lot of other people's blood on my feet, but it didn't seem to bother me. It didn't seem to worry me at all. A few weeks later, the results came back negative anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, we buried our workmates, acquaintances. There was 9 in total for us. The Mickacs in Heidelberg in Victoria, after a service at the hospital where Nanette and Walter met. And it started to dawn on us that we weren't fitting in down at Port Arthur. We were all unwell. We seemed to be kept apart. We were being separated. A Salvation Army team of counsellors from Sydney and Hobart were so helpful. Major Don Woodlands was to become a special friend to us all. I don't know whether any of you have had any contact with him, but he's a marvellous man. And I was very go. I read a statement. We've been given a lot of witness statements, and that was one of Mr. Jim Laycott. And evidently a police officer arrived on the scene outside of the site, but he was talking to this man, and he'd witnessed, or he'd been to see the girl that was shot in the BMW. He'd seen the people shot at the toll booth, and he was there 3 minutes after. And he'd been our local cop down there for 12 years. He knew most of the guides, and he drove away. And we've never heard anything about him as far as the Port Arthur incident goes. So I found that very hard to handle, as I had him in my first aid classes. I taught him 2 or 3 courses. I don't know where we go from here, but we need help. We need, as Australian citizens, we need to know the truth. I don't know whether we ever will, but we must have that coronial inquiry, not a royal commission. And because of the display of courage and bravery at Port Arthur on that terrible day, the injured victims who were alive when they were found survived, and they're still alive as far as I know. The last thing that I'd like to say is that it has been reported that a lot of us have psychiatric conditions. We have indeed. I still see a psychiatrist. I've been in hospital many times, and in an effort to beat my depression, I've also had shock treatment. I even tried to commit suicide to find peace. This was about 14 months ago. In this, I'm not alone. We are not paranoid, and I've told you this because I think the powers that be will attack my mental state. I'm not mad, I'm just sad. I have no affiliations with any political parties, or I don't belong to any shooters.
It takes a great deal of courage for many people to simply speak publicly. To speak on such an issue and to relive those experiences indeed shows us that Wendy has the courage to speak out. Yes?
If I'm correct, can you hear me? How's that? Got it. If I'm correct, you said not a royal commission?
No.
Yes. No royal commission.
No royal commission, we need a coronial inquiry.
Why? Could you say why?
Yes, quite simply.
I wonder if we could leave that to Andrew a little later. Thank you, sir. Yes, next question, Chris.
Yes, forgive me, I did get here late. I've travelled a long distance, and my question relates to a report that I'd heard that there had been a rifle stuck underneath a table, and that the person, presumably not Martin Bryant, had arrived there, grabbed the gun, and shot everyone from there. Did you give any report of during the shooting? Did you see the person shooting?
I didn't see the person shooting at all. Well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Andrew might be able to later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I was told there was a media blackout in Tasmania immediately following the shooting, and down there people just didn't know what was going on. I spoke to someone in my immediate area, and he confirms that his parents used to ring every night after the news to find out what the latest was. Could you confirm that?
I can confirm that. There wasn't an actual media blackout, but it was what the media said was very, very controlled, and I have heard that the people on the mainland had a lot more information given than what we did.
Thank you. Yes, next question, please.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Wendy. That was very good. The question I've got to ask is, do you have any idea at all how long the shooting went on for, in minutes? Because there's a lot of controversy about that, you see.
Thank you.
I can tell you now for sure it was 4 to 5 minutes.
Right, thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks for your presentation.
Could
you tell me what politicians you wrote to and what questions you asked and what answers you received, please?
Well, we've contacted every politician in Australia. A lot didn't answer, but some of the ones that did promised to do something. And then when we sort of wrote the next letter and finally put some more hard words on them and get some answers, we didn't get a reply.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Wendy, I take it that you were not interviewed by the police about this massacre. Have you got any idea why?
I was interviewed by the police, but as soon as I got to the Broad Arrow part of it, they didn't want to know any more. And I also wasn't going to be going to court if there had been a trial.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, you earlier said that there were 500 people in the cafe at the time of the shooting.
No, I didn't say that. There were 500 people at Port Arthur.
Oh, at Port Arthur. Were all the people in the cafe killed?
No. There were supposedly, according to the court, there were 20 killed, 12 injured with 29 bullets.
Yep. Do you agree with the book, in principle, the book Deadly Deception at Port Arthur? Have you read the book?
I have got an article in it, but it's there's a lot I don't agree with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
In your experience as a nurse, have you ever had any dealings with impaired mental abilities of patients, and do you think that an impaired person could have shot people like that?
Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66 and a mental age of 11, and I don't think he possibly could have carried it out in the 90 seconds to 2 minutes that the court says.
Thank you, Wendy. Next question, please.
Firstly, congratulations. You mentioned three shots very late in the day at an establishment opposite to where you were working, and it sounds like it was dark because you said you didn't want to put the lights out. And then you mentioned that the police turned up. I think you said it was later than the 3 shots, and I wonder if you'd be kind enough to relate the timing of those shots as to when you received the information that the suspect was being holed up in the other place that I'm not sure of the name of.
Seascape. The police shots went off at about 6:30. 3.
Was that police shots or 3 shots?
3 shots.
3 shots, thank you.
Sorry, I might have said police. And at 7:30, the police left Turana to come in. I've got a document saying that even the coroner wasn't allowed into Port Arthur wasn't to leave there until 7:30 because the situation wasn't safe. But they didn't care about all those people that we had there. And I might add, there were plenty of police, only about half an hour away. They kept them there. They didn't let them in. And I've also got some handouts here that are in the room, and they relate to some of the staff, the treatment of the staff. They're fairly self-explanatory. There is a little story there about a mortuary truck, but I'm not going to take that off Andrew, and I think I've had enough at the moment. Thank you.
You know, the Hobart Mercury, in a report recently on Wendy Skerr, said that she was talking with a Victorian man, Andrew McGregor. And I thought it was interesting to refer to Andrew as a Victorian man. One wonders whether they could have mentioned a former police man. This may have had something to add to the credibility of what was being said. For indeed, Andrew was a member of the Victorian Police Service for 17 years. And as I said earlier, he's speaking on the same topic as Wendy, Port Arthur, Deceit and Terrorism. And he joins Wendy as our first two speakers at the 2001 Inverell Forum. Andrew, sadly, is no stranger to tragedy. In 1967, his sister was murdered. And Andrew was aware that the police at the time knew of threats to his sister's life, but took no effective action. And he believes that her life could have been saved and she would be alive today, only for that police inaction. And this was the major motivation for Andrew becoming a member of the police force, in the attempt or belief that he could do it differently. Andrew was in the old Victorian Scottish Regiment for 5 years. Tonight his talk is divided into 5 sections. The way he's done that is to give us an opportunity to ask questions after each section relevant to that section. The first section is the Broad Arrow Cafe. The second is moving from the cafe to the Seascape Lodge and the start of the siege. The third section is to do with the weapons that we used. The fourth section is to do with Martin Bryant's arrest and many, many unusual coincidences that have happened around that time and since then. And the fifth section is to do with what has happened since the time of Port Arthur. He's not previously spoken publicly on what he knows. Tonight we will get the full story for the first time. Andrew has written a book on Port Arthur, Deceit and Terrorism, the Massacre at Port Arthur. On the back there's a quote. It says, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania." This was Barry Unsworth as New South Wales Premier in December 1987, 9 years before the Port Arthur killings. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the Inverell Forum stage Andrew McGregor.
Thank you, Dennis. You referred to me as being a former member of the Victoria Police Service. We actually called it the Victoria Police Force. All right, I'll start. Wendy Skerr and I have come here tonight to pass on what information we have in relation to the Port Arthur massacre. I have used their documents, articles and interviews to gather this information. Neither Wendy nor I will accept any bunkum as the gunman being equal to the world's top anti-terrorist combat shooters for 2 reasons. 1, the shooting inside the Broad Arrow Cafe lasted approximately 5 minutes. 2, There was in excess of 41 shots fired inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. This is from some of the survivors from both inside and outside the cafe. Let's name some of these survivors. Firstly, there is Wendy Skerr, who is with us tonight. Then there is Major Sandra Vanderpeer, who was inside the gift shop area, and in her statement states that the shooting lasted approximately 5 minutes. And she believed that the shooting continued after the gunman reloaded inside the gift shop area. Graham Collier, an ex-RAF fitter, states that he watched the gunman walk around the cafe area shooting people for approximately 4.5 minutes as he lay on the floor nearly drowning in his own blood. Outside, near the information centre, 2 Vietnam veterans, John Godfrey and Peter Stainthorpe, also have contested the 90 seconds to 2 minutes time for the shooting inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. Jackie Lane wrote an article in a police magazine again stating that the shooting went on for about 5 minutes. The time frame for the gunman shooting inside the cafe for 90 seconds to 2 minutes maximum is fabricated. It is an outright lie, and any person peddling that story is pushing a concoction, an outright lie. All the witnesses tell us that the gunman went up to the victims and shot them from fairly close quarters. What the Americans tell me is that anyone with a little bit of proper training in firearms would be able to accomplish this deed, and I accept their advice. What this means is that Martin Bryant would have been able to perform the shooting skills required at the Broad Arrow Cafe with minimum training if he had wished to commit such an atrocity. However, there are many clues that state it was not Martin Bryant inside the cafe on that fatal afternoon. More bunkum is the statement that the gunman killed 12 victims and wounded another 4 in the first 15 seconds. This statement is supposedly supported by the Wilkinson videotape, and this tape recorded the sound of the shots by themselves. Another video camera recorded the shots fired for 25 seconds as being 21 shots, which according to the government prosecutor, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, leaves only 8 shots to be fired in the next 65 seconds. That is 1 shot every 8.5 seconds. This is not what the witnesses tell us. They all state that the shots continued at about 1 shot every second or 2. Now, one moment. I don't think... Unfortunately, this doesn't show up, but on the CD-ROM you will hear it. The last shot, the 17th shot, is a ricochet. What? In the Wilkinson tape there are 5 shots fired, being shot 7 to 11 within a period of 1.80 seconds. And we are supposed to believe that any person could shoot 5 persons accurately in the head in that time? Thank you. Mind you, as I said, the last shot heard on the Wilkinson videotape is a ricochet. The next piece of bunkum is that 29 shots were fired inside the cafe. Mr. Bugg, QC, continually reinforces this statement, stating it is supported by the ballistics and forensic evidence. But the Tasmania Police ballistics expert, Sergeant Jared Dutton, states otherwise. In the American Wound Ballistics Review, Dutton states that 30 fired cartridge cases were located inside the Broad Arrow Cafe, not 29. Then again, in another article written by Sergeant Jared Dutton in the Australian Police Journal, Dutton argues that it is not accurate to count the number of shots fired simply by the means of the fired cartridge cases alone, especially as the crime scenes were not protected until after sunset, and many of the fired cartridge cases had been souvenired, especially in the car park where only 4 cases were located by the police. 2.223 and 2.308 cartridges, with another case being returned by a bus driver. How many shots were fired inside the Broad Arrow Cafe during the massacre? I have calculated a minimum of 41 shots using the court document and witness statements. So why were these deceptions put into place? And why have they been so strongly enforced within Australia? These lies have nothing to do with any federal government implementation plans, but rather a cover-up by the Tasmanian government, which are the owners of the Port Arthur historic site. And it has everything to do with the supposedly locked fire escape door.
The cause of the murders was not a door. The cause of the murders was Martin Bryant firing lethal weapons at people in a very short space of time, a matter of seconds, and murdering 20 people in the Broad Arrow Cafe and 15 elsewhere, and of course wounding many people. I don't believe that door issue is a principal factor in the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Ray Groom. You see, there was a fire exit door within the gift shop area of the Broad Arrow Cafe that was supposedly locked. But just how do you lock a fire exit door? This was the door that prevented many people who were inside the gift shop area from escaping the gunmen. And some were murdered, and others lost their partners and loved ones. It was later conceded that this door was not locked, as stated, to the Hobart Supreme Court, but rather it was broken. And the condition of the door was known to police by the 1st of May 1996, when one of the maintenance crew who was painting out the windows and nailing the doors and windows shut discovered that fault with the assistance of one of the forensic police within the building. The next little gem is the Prince sports bag, or should I say 2 Prince sports bags. You see, the gunman was lugging around a very heavy Prince sports bag and a large video camera, which were then found left on a table inside the Broad Arrow Cafe after the massacre. The problem is that several witnesses also saw the gunman carry the Prince sports bag out of the cafe and put it in the boot of the Volvo. This was even captured on James Velasco's video.
Dumbfounded, and I saw a man walk out of the cafe. We were 50 feet away from him, and he was carrying a rifle. There's somebody going crazy, shooting people here. There he is, he's over there. I can't believe it. He walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
As Bryant went to the boot of his Volvo,
he's picking up the bag now.
Rifle, James Velasco was doing some shooting of his own. Shooting with his home video.
That's the guy right there.
Velasco's fiancée Cynthia saw Bryant claim another victim.
Royce, our driver, stepped out behind the bus and walked towards the cafe, towards the front of the coaches to see what was going on. And
I'm running out of time, so I'm going to cut it off here. No.
Left the cafe at 1:32. He'd been inside less than 2 minutes, yet he killed 20 people. Steve.
If you have a look at that area, see all the tables, they're all nice and neat. Everything's nice and clean. And that is supposed to be a building where a massacre has just occurred. Why did the gunman need his video camera? Why did he need 2 Prince sports bags? Also consider that there were live .308 rounds found on the floor inside the cafe. The only weapon used inside the cafe was the AR-15, which uses .223 ammunition. But in the boot of the Volvo were several hundred .308 rounds. So how did these .308 rounds end up inside the cafe? At this stage, I should also point out 2 other little discrepancies that have occurred within the story of this massacre. The first is that the current affair program showed a person running down the road towards the buses and inferred that this person was the gunman. Nothing could be further from the truth. This person is running, and the gunman never ran. This person is dressed completely differently to the gunman and is carrying blankets from the information centre to the wounded at the buses, and is, in all probability, Mark Kirby, one of the many at the site who assisted so admirably after the massacre. The video is genuine. It is the portrayal of this video that is not.
Still standing there looking at him, but he walked right by me, not far away from me, just walked out of there as casual as can be.
But the killing spree continued. 2 minutes later, there were 20 dead and nearly as many wounded.
The other discrepancy is the missing boat. The aerial shot of Port Arthur that has been bandied about, supposedly stating that there's no boat in the area immediately inside the jetty area of Port Arthur, is again misleading. All a person has to do is look at the right of the picture and he or she will see two boats, the larger boat being the supposedly missing boat. The video taken by James Velasco was taken at extreme zoom, which is why the boat appears closer than it actually was. And any person who watches cricket, football or any of the sports on television would be aware of this. Now that's the end of part one.
Tony Pitt, the one thing that puzzles me, if this guy running away was so-and-so, the photo at the Volvo is very clearly Martin Bryant, or a guy with long hair. And who was doing the shooting if it wasn't Martin Bryant? Now the guy's running away, he goes to the Volvo and he shoots at the cameraman. That's
the next section, I'm afraid, Tony.
Oh, right, okay, that's what I want to see explained, because I see a guy running away, he starts shooting at the cameraman, and the cameraman has shown him to be a fellow with long hair. Who's doing the shooting?
Thank you, Tony. One of the things we should point out is that the person with long hair at the Volvo was the gunman. That particular videotape was taken by James Velasco at extreme zoom. However, the Wilkinsons also took a very similar videotape from a different angle. It's not as clear as James Velasco's, but you can still see the gunman there, and you can see the Volvo drive out. There's only one shot fired at James Velasco.
Thank you, Andrew.
I shall now move on to the next part of the massacre and touch very briefly on Constable Chris Isles of Sorrel. Chris Isles had been a New Bena policeman for about 12 years and had been transferred to Sorrel about 6 months prior to the massacre. And his replacement at New Bena was Constable Paul Hyland. Many people are aware that Constable Paul Hyland and Gary Whittle of Denali were at Saltwater River when they received a radio message at 13:38 hours that there had been a shooting at Port Arthur. However, Jim Laycock states that within 3 minutes of Zoe Hall being murdered and Glenn Pierce being kidnapped outside the Broad Arrow store, which was at approximately 1:45 p.m, Constable Chris Isles had arrived at the scene in a marked police vehicle. Laycock's statement is corroborated by another witness, Kyle Spruce. Then Constable Chris Isles took off in pursuit of the gunman and was never heard of again within the events that constitute the Port Arthur massacre. Questions must arise regarding what Constable Chris Isles was doing out of his area on this quiet Sunday afternoon, and the fact that he never appears to be utilised, especially when the survivors at the Port Arthur site were required to wait for 6 hours before they received proper police presence. Again, having been the local Port Arthur policeman for 12 years, Constable Isles knew all the locals, the staff of Port Arthur and the emergency crews that were utilised to perform the various police duties for the police that were held back from attending at the site due to the dangers presented to the police. So Chris Isles vanishes, And then Constable Highland and Gary Whittle attend to Port Arthur, and then on to Seascape. However, there is another policeman to enter the scene. Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty from Bellarive Police Station has arrived at the scene. Sergeant Fogarty is also a team leader with the SOG. Both Highland and Whittle state that when they arrived at Seascape, the BMW was already burning at the front, and when the fire reached the back section of the vehicle, it exploded. Martin Bryant, in his police interview, states that he was knocking at the back door of Seascape when the BMW exploded, but also confuses himself by saying that he must have been burnt by the fire that destroyed the BMW. Martin Bryant also believes that the hostage died in the BMW fire. Now consider this. One of the task force members investigating the Port Arthur massacre has stated to witnesses that it was the SOG who set fire to the BMW, so as to negate its use to the persons inside Seascape as a means of escape. This means that if the BMW was already burning on the arrival of Highland and Whittle at Seascape, then the only reported SOG member at the scene at that time was Sergeant Fogarty, and therefore Fogarty would have had to have been the SOG member who set the BMW alight. The police task force member also stated that it was the same SOG member who set fire to Seascape Cottage, using the same means as with the BMW, that is, by firing a phosphorus grenade into the building. This grenade apparently went through the attic window facing onto the Arthur Highway. In his statement, Andrew Fogarty states that he fired off 2 illuminating flares over Seascape, but under the orders of Sergeant Morrison. Both Highland and Whittle state that they saw a naked person run into the Seascape Cottage, Highland stating that it was a black-haired person, and Whittle stating it was a female. There is no proof that the person that these constables saw was the one and the same, but it is fair enough to consider that it was. What we do know, though, is that this black-haired naked person was not Martin Bryant, nor would it have been the gunman. So who was she? Then we have Constable Allen stating that at one stage, just before dark, the gunman was spotted on the roof of an adjoining building, and he needed to be identified before the SOG marksman could shoot the offender. Constable Allen stated that when he put his head up out of the culvert to take a view of the gunman on the roof, he was shot at. The bullet striking the front bumper bar of the police car he was behind. Now this gives us 2 items of information. One, that the person shooting at Allen was listening to the police communications. And 2, that the gunman on the roof was not the person shooting at Constable Allen. Sergeant Fogarty would never have permitted a gunman in his sights to actually shoot another policeman. It has been noted that Sergeant Fogarty's brother, Michael Fogarty, who is also a member of the Tasmania Police SOG, shot and killed Joe Gillowitz in 1991, when their father, Superintendent Fogarty, was in charge of the Tasmania Police SOG. Superintendent Fogarty, I believe, was also in charge of the SOG in 96. Now, this incident with the shot at Constable Allen sparked off 2 other incidents. The first was with the SES and Fire Brigade members who have been monitoring the police communications. A fire truck did the rounds of Port Arthur, warning the personnel there that the gunman was on the loose and heading this way. This created absolute panic at Port Arthur site because there was still no protection for them from any police. The second incident was that the police commander, Assistant Commissioner Lupo Prinz, called in assistance from the Victoria Police SOG and then notified the National Crisis Centre in Canberra of their terrorist attack. I beg your pardon, terrorist situation. All this action by the Tasmania Police was as per the SOG manual prepared by SACPAV. Does anybody know what SACPAV is? That's, what is it, the Standing Advisory Committee on the Prevention Against Violence. It's a federal place body that controls the police SOGs, and in the SACPAV anti-terrorist plan that had been implemented in November 1995, now the SACPAV have control of various police state SOG bodies, but not only that, they also have trained other members of the police, such as the police media liaison officers. However, what is of real interest is the fact that the SACPAV is run by the Protective Security Coordination Centre, the PSCC, which is an intelligence body operating out of both the Federal Attorney General's Department and the Justice Department. It has also been recorded that the police special branches were also being run by the PSCC. We have been informed by a current affair that the 3 top Tasmania policemen, McCready, Prinz and Bennett, are all SACPAV trained. So was their immediate liaison officer, Jeff Easton, who prior to his appointment with the Tasmania Police was a communications officer at Canberra. Another immediate liaison officer was Peter Hazelwood, who has connections with the Hilton Hotel bombing back in 1978. This was the event that initiated the formation of SACPAV and the PSCC. Peter Hazelwood is ASIO. What other bodies are connected with SACPAV? ASIO is for a start, and of course the military. Then there is the Australian Federal Police, many of whose officers end up in the PSCC, the Australian Protective Service, which is an offshoot of the Australian Federal Police, and is also seen as another intelligence service, which, by the way, is responsible for the security at the Woomera Base, where rioting and illegal immigrants were treated with force outside that is considered proper by normal police forces. The Department of Foreign Affairs, and the list goes on, even to include bodies from New Zealand. But back to Tasmania and the siege at Seascape. By Monday morning, with the media from all over the world now focusing on Port Arthur, the Pink Palace, as the locals called Seascape Cottage, is set alight. By Martin Bryant, we are told, except for a task force member who states that it was by Sergeant Fogarty. This, of course, destroyed all the evidence that was to be found inside Seascape Cottage, except for the 2 murder weapons, which were found outside Seascape in a badly damaged state. As the police had been informed by Jamie inside Seascape during the siege. But the only person to emerge from the fire was Martin Bryant, who was arrested, handcuffed and placed in the back of an ambulance and conveyed to the Royal Hobart Hospital. Now consider these 2 statements made by CNN's John Radler, based in Sydney. He attended to Port Arthur along with another CNN employee, Hugh Williams of Sydney, but based in Berlin and at home at the time on leave. The first statement. Johnson, which is Superintendent Johnson, Jack Johnson, explanation of the fate of the Mecacs was the classic win-win soundbite. 2. This is certainly the case in CNN's coverage of the Port Arthur massacre, vis-a-vis the Tasmania Police. They came across as in control, competent, professional, effective and thorough. They got the culprit, got him reasonably quickly, got him alive and kept him alive. They built an ultimately overwhelming case against him. And they did all of this in the midst of what were, for all of them, uniquely challenging circumstances. Break 2. Questions?
It's Tony Pitt again. I've been thinking, and back in the video we had 17 shots in roughly 20 seconds. 15 seconds, okay. Now, I was twice in the winning team in the national titles pistol, and I came in 5th in the Queen's Medal with the rifle. Now, I did a quick tally, and at that shooting rate, in 4.5 minutes, we would have shot about 240 rounds of ammunition. There's a discrepancy between the 4.5 minutes and the number of shots. So, you know, I can handle the 17 shots, but I can't handle the 4.5 minutes. So could you just fix me up on that one?
Right, all right.
No,
I said the minimum shots fired. Now, this is shots where people have been killed or injured, 41. I'm not talking about all the others that missed. For a start, the gunman fired off the first round, the first magazine, changed magazines in the gift shop and continued firing. On completion of shooting Jason Winter, who was the last person shot, the gunman then went to the door and reloaded, and then stepped out onto the balcony and continued down to the car park. I have no idea how many shots were fired. People keep on telling me, including Vietnam vets, about 50 to 60 rounds were fired inside the cafe. I've only been able to calculate 41. But I haven't been in there to see all the bullet holes, all, we'll say, the matter sort of thing that, we'll say, the bullets would have dragged onto the roof, on the walls, and anywhere else. But I can tell you this much. There are only 7 particles of bullets found inside the cafe by the New South Wales forensic team. And the New South Wales forensic team are the best forensic team in Australia. They only found 7. They didn't look very well.
At the time of the massacre, the news media told us that Martin Bryant was holed up in Seascape, and it was situated in the middle of a cleared paddock, was unapproachable, and he was firing a large number of rounds, and they couldn't approach it. Would you comment on that?
Seascape Cottage was on the south side of Long Bay. It's got water on one side. It has the Arthur Highway on the other. The Long Bay goes almost to the edge of the Tasman Highway. On the other side of the Tasman Highway is an extremely steep hill. The police, 2 police were on the road in a culvert. An SOG member gone up to a local building, Ben Bullen, I think it was called, came down through the scrub and were situated slightly above that culvert to keep an eye on. They had police to the north on a small strip of land, which is, there's a lot of small vegetation, which was good cover. On the south side, there's another recently open paddock, but there were some trees, there was some cover, and 2 different teams of 2 members from the Tasmania Police SOG had been stationed on the south side. The road was above Seascape Cottage, just looking down, going down into the gully. The Seascape Cottage had been built on the flat just right at the water's edge. It was a very beautiful, very scenic screen, and it's a very easily defended area.
That's better. Just, I'd just like you to go over the relationship with the Tasmanian SOG again for us a little bit slowly. I think you mentioned something like father and son teams or some sort of incestuous relationship here. If you could just run through that a little slowly and step by step, I'd appreciate that greatly. Thank you.
It's not incestuous, it's despotic. The father was Superintendent Fogarty. Superintendent Fogarty appeared at the Royal Commission held in Hobart last year in relation to the Gillowitz shooting. And when he was there, his solicitor jumped up with a staff deck was made out by the head of the PSCC, who was a lawyer with neither military nor police training. That's Superintendent Fogarty. He had 2 sons who were in the police force. Mark Fogarty, who shot and killed Joe Gillowitz in 1991, who was in the SOG, and his brother, Sergeant Andrew Mark Fogarty, who was also a team leader in the SOG and was a uniformed sergeant stationed at Belrive Police Station.
Andrew, can you just run the bit by me again, the local policeman of 12 years at Port Arthur that disappeared? Just run that by me again a little bit slower, please.
Constable Chris Isles had been a policeman for 12 years, but 6 months before Port Arthur, had transferred to Sorrel. He was very well known in the area, a big lad, apparently he's bigger than I am. On the Sunday, this night's quiet Sunday, he was in the area. There is no sign whatsoever of any communications. He's not mentioned in any document whatsoever, except the statements by Jim Laycock, Kyle Spruce, and an Asian gentleman whose name I have forgotten, but he was hiding in a cemetery or something behind the store, who saw the police car go off down the road with lights and sirens flashing. But he was there, he went down the road. Now the biggest problem I have is it's only 4 to 5 k's from the Port Arthur General Store to Seascape Cottage. And there is no road off. They've got a few drive-ins to holiday homes and some caravan park, and there wasn't any sign of him even driving past the Fox and Hounds Hotel. He's completely vanished. We don't know, we've seen nothing, but we've got the statement that he was there. And that's extremely illuminating. That information has been suppressed.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, last question, sir.
Any of the bullets or the cartridge cases that were found, were they subsequently linked by forensics to any particular weapons?
I haven't read Sergeant Derek Dutton did a 200-page report, ballistics report, and I haven't got that. However, both firearms were badly damaged. I doubt if you could link the AR-15 because the bullet exploded in the breech. It would have created damage to the breech, so I doubt if they could link the actual cartridge case. The FAL-FN, again, was badly damaged, but I really, again, I haven't seen anything where it actually was, though I would presume that it would be. Sergeant Dutton sort of think it was a competent and honest policeman. Most of Sergeant Dutton, Sergeant McCarthy, the police negotiator, most of the people involved in this will be extremely honest and diligent policemen. It's only a couple of players sort of thing that you must really start questioning.
Thank you. And
one comment. If a bullet explodes in the breech, somebody wears the bits of breech.
Thank you. Would you like to comment or leave that?
That's right out of my field, Tony.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. If you carry on with section 3.
Right, thank you. The Tasmania Police set up a task force under Superintendent Johnston to investigate the Port Arthur massacre. A member of that task force, Inspector Maxwell, travelled to Victoria and spoke to a Bill Drysdale of Yass in relation to one of the murder weapons, the AR-15. Bill Drysdale identified that firearm by the gunsmith's mark on the barrel. Furthermore, this particular firearm had been handed to the Victoria Police at Lilydale in 1993, when that particular firearm had been made illegal. However, the AR-15 firearm that had been handed into the Victoria Police during this amnesty were then issued to the Victoria Police SOG as weapons until they were issued with new weapons in 1994. And these AR-15s were then sold to a Bendigo gun dealer for sale overseas. Apparently, Tasmania is overseas. Except for one. The compact AR-15, or the carbine AR-15, that had once been the property of Bill Drysdale. It went through the police books as being destroyed at the Sims Metal Furnace, but somehow ended up in Tasmania at the Seascape Cottage after the siege. However, this damaged AR-15 could not have been the weapon used at Port Arthur. It was damaged by blowing up around inside the breech. The creation of this damage also creates a loud explosion, enough to deafen a person for up to a couple of days. Please note that Martin Bryant's hearing was not affected when he was arrested at Seascape. Also note that all the police statements during the siege tell of the various weapons being fired, which they could differentiate by the sounds alone. And when the fire took place, they could also tell the difference between exploding ammunition and shots being fired. But not one mention is made of an extremely loud explosion that must have occurred when the AR-15 was damaged. Thus, the only conclusion was that this weapon was damaged prior to the siege, and thus prior to the massacre. The other weapon used during the massacre was an FNS SLR, of which Martin Bryant denied ever owning. Mind you, the firearm that was suddenly found in the piano at Bryant's Clare Street residence, an Australian armed semi-automatic, .223, is never mentioned in the only police interview that took place on the 4th of July. So much for Independence Day. That was a short one. Now come on. Tony?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, your question, please. Just one question related to these fires. There was, you stated that the SOG men fired flares, but you've also mentioned phosphorus grenades for the house and the car, right? Now, would it be normal to issue phosphorus grenades to an SOG man? And if so, would he just sort of carry them around in case he might ever happen to need them?
I've got a big worry about that last one. All right, the task force member said phosphorus grenades. Sergeant Fogarty's statement says illuminating flares. Now, they may be one and the same. I've been out the police force a little bit too long. I've never used these items of equipment. I do know policemen normally do not carry such things in the boot of their police vehicle. The other extremely interesting fact, which I haven't mentioned, is Constable Paul Hyland's statement states that the Seascape Cottage area was illuminated by a street-type lighting. Now, if you have street-type lighting in the area, why would you need to fire off illuminating flares?
Yes, sir.
Cases which were removed from the various shootings. Could that have happened to prove that if there were two guns used in the shooting, you would forensically be able to identify the cases with two guns? If a whole series of guns was used, you could prove by the cases when they expand in the different chamber sizes and with different chamber marks that they were fired in different guns. So the removal of the bullet cases could in fact be removing the evidence. And in fact destroying the chambers of both guns would then not be able to tie in the cases that were found with the guns that were allegedly used. Does that make sense?
Right over my head.
In any bullet case, once extracted, you can ascertain which gun it was fired in.
Yes.
Right. So if a whole lot of different guns were used, you'd have a whole lot of different cases which would have been obviously fired from different guns.
The interesting fact is that apparently 15 firearms were destroyed in the burning of Seascape Cottage. Now, we're told that the guns there belonged to the son, Glenn Martin. I don't know gun nut yet who would keep his firearms at his parents' house, you know, an hour and a half away from home. Secondly, Glenn Martin, in an article printed in the Melbourne Sunday Herald Sun, states quite emphatically his parents didn't have any firearms on the property. He didn't have any. So where did the firearms come from? Martin Bryant didn't have them. The police never interviewed Martin Bryant about the Australian arms semi-automatic that was found in the piano at his property. Never touched that subject. Martin Bryant always admits he owned 3 firearms: the AR-10, the AR-15, and the Daewoo shotgun. Martin Bryant also states quite specifically that the AR-10 and the Daewoo shotgun frightened him when he used them because he was a left-handed shooter. And especially with the AR-10, if he had fired it from the left shoulder, he'd quite easily end up wearing one very hot cartridge down his thing, and it would burn him. And that explains why Martin Bryant was quite frightened of these things backfiring or ricocheting out. But he really liked the AR-15.
Thank you, Andrew. By the way, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Don't think that people will know or whatever. It's an unusual opportunity. Make sure you take it. Yes, sir.
I'm unaware of whether the police found any spent projectiles in the cafe, but one would think that there would have to be spent projectiles either lodged in the wall or in the persons of the victims. Now, it's a simple matter to match those projectiles with the alleged rifles that were so conveniently not burnt at Seascape. Even if the chamber is damaged, the barrels could be cut off a foot back from the end and a blank projectile forced through the barrel with a high tensile rod to imprint the rifling on it, and then they could be compared. Do you know if that comparison or those tests have ever been done?
Gerard Dutton has never informed me. One of the things I do know is the Americans asked him, sort of thing, if they had any actual evidence that it definitely linked Martin Bryant to the cafe. Gerard Dutton replied, no.
Thank you. Yes, Ted.
You mentioned one picture had two boats, one had one. Does that indicate that you think whoever they were escaped in one of those boats?
No, not at all. The video taken by James Velasco shows one boat. When you have a look at the area photograph, there are two boats, and on the right side there are two different boats, but they are separated, and the larger boat is the boat that appears on the video. So the two boats both stayed there, but only one was able to be viewed on that particular video.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes.
Yes, I read a book by a fellow called Joe Vialis, and I later spoke to him, and I actually met his wife. What I believed from there, and have been telling various people, is that there were 29 shots fired, leaving one shot in the breach, and then he, having killed like 20 people or something with those shots, and then put in another magazine. From what you said, I haven't sort of quite figured if you believe that is not the case, that he didn't shoot 20 people in 30 seconds or something of that nature.
20 people, 4.5 minutes. 2 magazines used. I don't know how many shots were actually fired. 2 magazines. The figures of 29 and 90 seconds were invented by the DPP, Mr. Damien Bugg, QC, to protect the Tasmanian government from any action in relation to a duty of care and responsibility to a locked or a broken fire exit door. Mind you, it's extremely interesting, the rumour that states that the authority was so incompetent, the one thing they didn't have covered under their insurance was murder-suicide.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, madam, if you have a question, could you pop up to the mic, please? I wonder if you could pop up to the mic, and you get it recorded that way, you see. That's why the mic's there. It's important to make sure that the question is heard as well as the answer. Thank you, madam.
Whose fingerprints were on the video camera?
I'm not told, but I believe at least one person, one survivor from the Port Arrows Cafe did handle it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
There was you explained that there was 2 fellows that indicated there was 4.5 or 5 minutes time during the shooting. Is that correct?
No, there's several more.
Several more. You only mentioned 2. One said 5.
There's Wendy Skerr.
Wendy Skerr said tonight she wasn't sure. She said the shooting started just before 7:30 and it finished a minute and a half after.
No, 7:30 p.m. 6:30 p.m. 3 shots were fired. The shooting inside the cafe. Is that what you're talking about?
The witnesses that you're using to establish that there's about 5 minutes lapsed time while the shooting was going on, yet the video cameras say something different.
No, the video camera records shots fired in 15 seconds. Another video camera continues on till 25 seconds. Once stopped, the shooting could have continued on for another 5 seconds, 5 minutes or 5 days, because there is no evidence to state the exact time.
That were questioned in relation to the time, the 4.5 minute fellow and the 5 minute fellow.
No, there's not two. I've got 2 Vietnam vets. I've Wendy Skur. I have Major Sandra Vanderpeer. And there most probably would be a couple of others. In the article that was printed in the Hobart Mercury about Wendy Skur coming to Inverell, there was 2 replies. One was anonymous, another one was from the person who managed a cafe near the Port Arthur site. They both confirmed the shooting within the cafe also took approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Just a very quick one. Were there any fingerprints identifying Martin Bryant on any of the cartridges found? Or the guns?
According to Gerard Sutton, reply to the Americans, no.
Thank you.
Headquarters in Hobart to obtain information about the shooting of Port Arthur. They were surprised to find that they were not the first to arrive at the media liaison officer. Mr. Roland Brown, the spokesperson for the gun control in Tasmania, had beaten them to it. Now this surely must be a coincidence. But there were other coincidences that do stand out. Helicopter pilots were normally a scarcity on a Sunday afternoon. Normally it is difficult even to locate one. But on this particular Sunday, they were able to obtain the services of 3 helicopter pilots. For the ambulance staff, the possible staff shortage was overcome by utilising staff and volunteers that were attending courses for that Sunday afternoon. The Southern District Mortuary Service even had a 22-body hearse waiting to be used for such an emergency. It was the only one of its kind in Australia, and it was stuck in the southern part of Tasmania, right on call. However, it was the Royal Hobart Hospital that demonstrated the height of preparedness. They were able to call on the services of 25 trauma specialist doctors from all over Australia, who had just completed a seminar at the midday on that Sunday afternoon, and whose last lecture had been in relation to a terrorist attack. Oh dear. It was the EMA, the Emergency Management Australia Port Arthur seminar papers, that demonstrated the preparedness of all these bodies, especially with the Royal Hobart Hospital and its newly completed Code Brown emergency plan. But we are then given another clue. The coroner, Ian Matheson, the staff at the Royal Hobart Hospital, including some doctors and many ambulance service personnel, initially believed it was simply another exercise. And some ignored the cause until they heard on the news, on the radio and television. In other words, these people had been conditioned to attending exercises until they were sick and tired of them. In his book, Suddenly One Sunday, journalist Mike Bingham wrote, involvement in these national and local exercises was to prove invaluable as Tasmania Police set about managing the Port Arthur massacre. The responses were to work so well that there were times when it all seemed like an exercise, despite the enormity of it all. The Tasmania Police did all of that. They weren't there for 6.5 bloody hours. So who was responsible for these people to be so prepared for such a tragedy? In Tasmania, the emergency exercises were the responsibility of the SES, the State Emergency Service. This body is attached to the Tasmania Police, and the Police Commissioner is the Deputy Chairman of the State Emergency Service. However, these bodies are controlled by the Canberra-based SACPAV, the Standing Advisory Committee on States and Commonwealth for the Protection Against Violence. The SACPAV subcommittee, the Project Group Training, the PGT, is responsible for the training and exercise programs run by SACPAV. But then again, SACPAV is controlled by the PSCC, the intelligence agency. There is, however, one last seminar to consider, and that is unique in that it was the first, the only ever seminar to be held for the top 10 personnel at the Port Arthur Historic Site. And it was to be held on the 28th and 29th of April 1996. What was this seminar about? Nothing. By the time these particular staff members arrived at Swansea, the massacre had occurred and everybody went straight back to the site to assist. Next one.
Yes, do we have any questions about some of those fascinating coincidences?
Not one question about Roland Brown.
Andrew, is there something else you want to say about the gentleman?
What happened with Roland Brown, once Roland Brown is at the Police Information Centre, it is no longer an information centre, it's now been made a propaganda centre. It's as simple as that. Port Arthur was in fact, the very fact, a media exercise. The media were catered for in every possible way. The human beings, the volunteers and everybody else at Port Arthur were totally ignored.
Thank you, Andrew. If you could carry on with the last section 5.
But back to Martin Bryant, who has been arrested by the SOG and conveyed to the Royal Hobart Hospital. On Tuesday the 30th of April 1996, police endeavoured to interview Martin Bryant in the presence of a hospital doctor, but Bryant wishes to have nothing to do with them, and so he is simply charged with one count of murder, that of Kate Scott. On the following day, Martin Bryant was again interviewed, but not by police. Dr. Ian Sale. In notes taken by the prison officer guarding Martin Bryant, Sir Blavel, Sale states to Bryant, "Whatever you say to us may be used against you in court. Do you understand what I said? Consider the implications of this evidence, if this evidence is correct. Dr. Sale has just stated that he is collecting evidence to use against Martin Bryant in a court of law. Yet his reports form part of the basis of Mullen's report, which was the only evidence used by the defence in the sentencing of Martin Bryant." Bryant was interviewed by Dr. Sale on the 1st and the 3rd of May, and then by Mullen on the 5th of May. During each of these interviews, apparently the same prison officer was present and apparently took notes. This raises questions due to who had custody of Bryant at the time. Bryant should have been under police guard until he was lodged at Risdon Prison. And we have a policewoman stating that she was at one stage required to perform guard duty on Bryant. Again, this same prison officer took note of the conversation between Martin Bryant and Petra Woolman on the 15th of May at Risdon Prison. In fact, up until the police interview, the only contributor to confessional evidence is that by this one officer. In late August, another prison officer gives evidence, but on the whole there are many errors within these confessional statements. In his report on Martin Bryant that was read to the Supreme Court on the 20th of November 1996, Mullen refers to the fact that Martin Bryant was put on a guardianship order by the Hobart Court in October 1993. That the case was actually heard in camera, which is private, by the judge on the 22nd of April 1994 was not mentioned by Mullen, nor was the fact that the application was brought under the Mental Health Act, or the fact that Bryant was represented by solicitors from the firm Griffiths and Jackson of Hobart, due to the simple fact that Martin Bryant was not present at the court on that day, because he was in London. What the guardianship order states emphatically, and this is something that the learned professor should have been well aware of, was that the court considered Martin Bryant, due to his mental inability, was not competent to make any plea in relation to the charges which he was facing in November 1996. Not only that, but the Chief Justice, Mr. William Cox, would also have been well aware of that little problem. Oh dear me. However, back to Professor Mullen. In 2000, last year, Mullen, along with another psychiatrist, Christopher H. Cantor, and another gentleman, Philip Albers, wrote an article titled Mass Homicide, the Civil Massacre, in which they used 7 lone nut gunman type massacres to prove their findings. These cases are 1. Julian Knight, Melbourne in 1987. 2. Michael Ryan, Hungerford, England, 1987. 3. Frank Victovich, Melbourne, 1987. 4. David Gray, Aramamana in New Zealand in 1990. 5. Wade Franken, Strathfield in 1991. 6. Thomas Hamilton, Dunblane, Scotland in 1996. And 7. Martin Bryant, Port Arthur, 1996. These 7 massacres are all seemingly related by circumstances, besides the fact that they were used specifically to introduce firearm control by the governments of the day. Christopher H. Cantor is a psychiatrist affiliated with the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention program at Griffith University, and is the author of several anti-firearm articles going back to at least 1991. Philip Albers has penned similar articles. One would have to wonder if these persons have any links with either the Australian Institute of Criminology or the National Committee Against Violence. Professor Mullen is stated in this article as having interviewed Julian Knight and Martin Bryant after the events and resided in the area affected by Gray. In fact, we are aware that Mullen's report on Bryant was the only psychiatric report presented to the Supreme Court, which makes Mullen more than just an interviewer of Bryant. There are 2 aspects worth considering in this article before I delve any further into it. In every case except Frankham and Bryant, the only weapons used were firearms. However, both Frankham and Bryant lost a parent prior to their massacres by suicide. Both Frankham and Bryant not only used high-powered firearms, but a large knife and handcuffs as well. The use of handcuffs in any lone nut gunman style massacre is uniquely Australian. The perpetrators of such crimes do not intend to constrain victims, but rather murder anybody within their sights. Yet we are informed that whilst at Seascape, Martin Bryant, also known as Jamie, had information regarding his cottage Glen Piers that would have only come from an interrogation. For Martin Bryant, though, this would have been a virtual impossibility, considering his stated mental ability. Is this simple a coincidence? I would doubt it. There are other coincidences. The last sentence in the report on Julian Knight states, JK's subsequent course in prison has made any psychotic condition highly unlikely. But obsessional personality traits and narcissism have become more obvious. The obvious question here is that if Julian Knight is no longer a threat to our society, then why was he a threat on the 9th of August 1987 when he murdered 7 persons and attempted to murder another 17? In the report on Frank Victovich, it states that this person, who obviously had a long-standing fascination with firearms, obtained an M1 carbine .30 caliber semi-automatic military-style firearm with a sawn-off barrel and a shortened stock. Mind you, these alterations were made so the weapon would fit into the bag, which was used to carry the weapon to the scene of the massacre, and completely destroys the statement that Victovich had a fascination with firearms, as any student of weaponry would know that by cutting off the end of the barrel removed the gas pressure that caused the firearm to automatically reload. This meant that to create the massacre, Victovich had to manually reload the rifle after each shot. Moreover, this created the possibility for the weapon to jam should the reloading action become jerky, which is exactly what happened with this particular incident and enabled two men to actually take hold of Vicovich before he apparently broke loose and jumped through a plate glass window and fell to his death 11 floors below. But what is extremely interesting is that two persons who, by sheer coincidence, happened to view the massacre from the building directly opposite. The then State Attorney General, Jim Kennan, and the Police Minister, Race Matthews. These two Labor Party politicians were part of the push in Victoria to introduce their tough new firearm laws. And it is by sheer coincidence that they just happened to be in the building where Jim Kennan's extremely secure offices were located on the 20th to 23rd floors. However, at the time of this incident, I am reliably informed that they were at a typing pool located on the 12th floor, with the massacre taking place in the building directly opposite on the 11th floor. Another interesting bit of trivia given to us by this report is that during his killing spree, Frank Victovich was heard making some rather startling comments, including, "How do they expect me to kill people with this gun?" Just exactly what did Vicovich mean by that statement, and who were they? It was very shortly after this massacre that a special Premier's meeting was called in Hobart, where national firearm laws were the agenda. But the plan was defeated due to Tasmania and South Australia not accepting the federal incursion into the state's constitutional powers. This was when Premier Barry Unsworth made his now famous quote of, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania." Please remember that in cases where the constitutions are involved, each and every state must accept the amendment. If any state declines, then the federal constitution amendment cannot continue. It's a backdoor way of avoiding a referendum. In the case report on Martin Bryant, this article has made some astounding statements. It states that the killings began with the murder of an elderly couple against whom Bryant's family held a long-standing grudge. This is not correct. There was never any grudge between the Bryant and Martin family. Mrs. Bryant denies it totally. So does Glenn Martin. The report continues. He believes that this long-standing grudge had contributed to the suicide of his father. No, never. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Martin Bryant believed that actions by the Martin had led to his father committing suicide 13 years later. The report states that this incident occurred only 6 weeks after Dunblane. That is correct. But there is not one mention of Dunblane in Mullen's report on Bryant, presented to the Hobart Supreme Court. This is highly irregular. Furthermore, when the report states that there have been suggestions that Martin Bryant may have been influenced by the two Melbourne incidents, being cases 1 and 3, there is no written report presented to the Supreme Court that follows this line of thinking. There is, however, evidence from a prison officer stating that Bryant considered himself worse than Ivan Milat, but the context of that statement remains unclear. I think you'll find that Martin Bryant was extremely upset that he had killed children. He considered the things he supposedly done was so evil, it was worse than Ivan Milat. The report states that a number of psychological assessments over the years failed to reach agreements as to diagnosis. The highly eminent Dr. Cunningham Dax stated that Bryant may be developing an illness of a schizophrenic type in an assessment in 1984. In 1991, Drs. Mather and MP McCartney diagnosed a schizophrenic illness. In 1994, Bryant has action brought against him by 2 doctors concerned about his apparent frittering away his inheritance under the Mental Health Act, and succeeds in having the Hobart Supreme Court place Martin Bryant under a guardianship. Mrs. Bryant states that her son is suffering from schizophrenia, as does his girlfriend Petra Wilmot. Mrs. Bryant refers to her son's psychiatrist, Dr. Rushton, who for some unknown reason is never mentioned in Mullen's report to the Supreme Court. However, it is only Dr. Sale and Professor Mullen who argue that Martin Bryant is not schizophrenic. The report goes on with numerous inconsistencies, especially in regards to Martin Bryant, but let me make one last comparison. In the closing paragraph of Mullen's report that was presented to Judge William Cox in the sentencing of Martin Bryant, Mullen writes, Mr. Bryant currently does not have the signs and the symptoms of a mental illness. He is, however, by virtue of his personality and intellectual limitations, both of reduced coping ability and of increased psychological vulnerability, it is possible that under the combined stress of lengthy incarceration and having to live with the memories and consequences of his awful acts, that he may, in the future, break down into frank mental illness. It will be necessary to continually monitor his state of mind during his future containment and initiate appropriate treatment if and when it is required. Now compare that little gem with this one previously mentioned regarding Julian Knight that stated, Julian Knight was examined by a number of psychiatrists and psychologists. Although a pre-psychotic condition was suggested, the predominant opinion was of a narcissistic young man involved in his world of fantasy. Julian Knight's subsequent course in prison has made any psychotic condition highly unlikely. But obsessional and personality traits and narcissism have become more obvious. What this article by Cantor, Mullen and Alphers does is emphasise the requirement for Australia's new firearm laws was demonstrated by 4 unique low-nut gunman type massacres in Australia. The uniqueness of these criminal acts does not simply stop at the cause and effect within Australia, but also the time slot that these crimes fall into. It was only after the ideology created the need for firearms to be removed from our society that these unique crimes erupted. Furthermore, when 2 of the main persons involved in the implementation of this new ideology actually were able to witness one of only 4 such events in Australia, we must consider that as extremely coincidental. I've got one last break. How are we going? What is... Oh, 9:30. No, I'm going fine. Probably could have missed out at 9 o'clock. I'm sorry about that.
Yes, sir, your question.
Yes, in the beginning, I think Wendy mentioned the coal mines and said that would be brought up later and it was important. I just wondered if... I haven't heard anything.
Wendy hadn't seen my speech. The coal mines were important in the fact that they were used to lure away the only known police presence in the area.
Thank you, sir.
In passing, you mentioned the chap being pushed out the window or getting through a plate glass window. How well prepared would a photographer have to be to get that picture the TV showed with him halfway down?
Say again?
You'd have to have it all set, ready to go. Doesn't take a man long to fall 2 stories.
11 floors. He apparently had been clinging onto the... After diving through the window, which had previously been, we'll say, broken by a bullet going through it, he then... Frank Victovic then apparently clung to the balcony outside the window for approximately 4 minutes before falling to his death. What type of person jumps through a window to commit suicide and then stops halfway and says, hang on, I've changed my mind?
Yes, sir.
I think what you've said about all the things at Port Arthur are very important, that sort of thing, and since there's no media representation here or anything to sort of repeat what you've said, I'd have a tough time telling what you said to my friends and that sort of thing. Is there any sort of pamphlets or a website even, like any... Okay.
So Andrew
I was just curious.
Published a book. He's put the book on a CD-ROM. And this way you can see far more than what you would normally get from a book. It'll be available for sale tonight.
Just quickly, that'll sort of be passing in circulation about people that care about these sort of things. In there where I live, this sort of stuff just doesn't get out there, what you've been saying.
we'll just take on what the media tells us, that sort of thing. Is there something like a... Because, I'd do a pamphlet drop and that sort of thing,
Look, I come from Geelong, down in Victoria. Its nickname is Sleepy Hollow. I know exactly what you're talking about. The information is there. Also, my speech here tonight is in there, plus a few other little items. You'll find them rather interesting. The only unfortunate problem is I keep on getting more and more information.
Yes, sir.
Well, here's a bit more.
Is this a question?
Well, like the Senate, like you make a statement in the form of a question, but it's a question, yeah, so please don't jump on me. Like most of the people here, we watched the media presentation as it unfolded, and I do recall that Martin Bryant had a lawyer, and initially this lawyer was in the media saying he'll plead not guilty, which of course means a trial and presentation of evidence and witnesses and all that stuff. Now, I saw after he got his new lawyer, and the new lawyer said, we're going to plead guilty, I saw on Channel 10 his first lawyer make this statement, words to this effect: there's some things about this trial that the Australian people should know, but I'm not allowed to tell you. Have you heard anything along those lines?
I didn't hear that one, but I've got a couple of little things going on to the trial of Martin Bryant, and also about his lawyer, his lawyer, John Avery. I am aware that the initial lawyer, David Gunson, stepped aside and let Martin Bryant be handled by John Avery when John Avery was incompetent. He had a conflict of interest in that he was also been previously representing Terry Hill, who was supposedly the person who supplied Martin Bryant with the firearms. You can't do that. The other thing is, after the sentencing of Martin Bryant, there was another court hearing where Bryant's property was confiscated by the Crown. And on this particular occasion, Martin Bryant was again represented by David Gunson. David Gunson never stood down, he simply stepped aside.
Thank you. Your question, sir.
Yes, Andrew. I wonder if you could please give us the reasons for the dismissal of the psychiatrist, Dr. Lopez. Yes.
Dr. Lopez hasn't informed me of that, but his dismissal followed an article that was written by Gary Linnell that appeared in the Bulletin magazine in May 1999, I think it was, where he questioned the IQ levels of Martin Bryant and the tests done by Dr. Ian Joblin. He said he believed they were flawed, which tells me that Martin Bryant's, we'll say, intelligence was higher than 66. The other thing he also questioned were, he states that Martin Bryant was not as silly or not as some people made him out to be. And by that I would believe that Lopez was again referring to Dr. Sale and Professor Mullen. I've got more information on that. It's far more easy for you to comprehend on the report on my chapter in relation to Professor Mullen.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, madam.
I have a timeline question to ask you. Jim Pollard was driving the BMW and was shot at the toll gate, right?
Yes.
Where it is undoubted that the shooting started, give or take, a minute around 1:30. At 5 to 4 at Bingara, a policeman arrived on a next of kin's door to notify them that that person had been killed at Port Arthur. At that stage, it really wasn't even hitting our rural airwaves.
How did you do that?
It is 40 minutes drive to the person's place out of Bingara, which meant that the timeline there would mean that that police would have had to have been notified approximately 3:15 p.m. on that day.
How could he do that?
Has there been a timeline done on the notification of any of the other victims' families?
No. Oh my God. How could the police know that? The police were not... The only policeman there at the time was Peter Hessman, and he arrived at 4:26. The police car then went out the gate at 4:30, and that is recorded by staff at the Port Arthur Historic Site.
That is the question, because the policeman definitely arrived at this home with 2 witnesses at 5 to 4 on that afternoon.
I think you people now completely understand why I say I keep on getting new information all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just an oddity on the IQs. I had an uncle who had an IQ of probably 155, 160, a very clever man. Drove a car 40 miles with a flat tyre because he could not change a wheel. Now, my IQ, I happen to know, is accompanied, I won't give it, is accompanied with a plus. The plus alongside your IQ when I had mine done meant that your mental ability was matched by your manual dexterity. Now, has Martin Bryant got A+? Is there any manual dexterity with this bloke?
I have no idea. They don't tell us that.
Well, obviously without the manual dexterity, it wouldn't matter whether he was smart or not. He couldn't do it.
He couldn't do what they say he's done.
Exactly.
They tell lies. And the number one thing I learnt in the police force, you do not believe a person who tells you lies. Oh, I don't know. You know how dumb these bloody policemen are, especially from Victoria.
Yes, sir, your question.
Are you aware of any other case in the history of Australian jurisprudence which has had evidence locked up for 30 years?
Oh, this is a beauty. This is a beauty. That's another lie. All the information we obtained under the Freedom of Information. And that was obtained by my friend Noel MacDonald, who's also writing a book about Port Arthur. I let him do all the heavy work. I just scratch my head sort of thing and try to put the stuff together. But we've got the court document. We've got all the witness statements that were going to be used by the prosecution. We've got the transcript, tapes that were taken at Seascape. We have the full unedited police interview of Martin Bryant, which was by 4 people, not the 2. It was by Inspector Ross Payne, Inspector John Warren, Policeman Sergeant Jones, and Detective Sharon Bolt. So we've got all of these under freedom. There's never been any suppression. The only suppression that came about was put on by the Judge William Cox for the duration of the court. And even then, the current affair broke that suppression.
Thank you. Your question, sir.
Andrew, has anybody or any group threatened you with the information that you're going around telling the people your version of what happened what you found out that happened at Port Arthur? Has any threats been made against you?
Not so much threats, but there have been, we'll say, other approaches. And that only occurred after my friend Noel MacDonald put up a website for me with parts of my book. And this was done through an internet site, a person from an internet site who calls himself Hamish the Inquisitor. It was done anonymously. The site is the publicdebate.com.au, and as far as I can determine, and I strongly believe that it is a sting operation run by the Protective Security Coordination Centre.
Thank you. Sir, your question.
Yes, in the matter of IQs, I've been told that if they gave me a brain scan, they'd demand a search fee, but there may be others present. I couldn't quite join the dots up in connection with Martin Bryant suddenly appearing in England when he was, as I remember, was incarcerated on a capital charge. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? I have heard something about the Tavistock Institute in this connection.
Find out as much of that as you can. It's extremely interesting. Martin Bryant was in London on the 22nd of April 1994 when the case on him brought under the Mental Health Act was heard in camera at the Hobart Supreme Court. And he was represented by Peter Griffiths of the firm Griffiths and Jackson. I have no idea how that could be permitted, but it was. Another interesting fact is that people in Hobart will state emphatically that Martin Bryant did have a shooter's licence, and when asked how he obtained it, he says, "My lawyer got it for me." Geez, I love lawyers. They can do anything.
Thank you. Yes, your question, sir.
I'm highly suspicious about the fact that Martin Bryant didn't have a jury trial. I mean, if somebody commits or is suspected of committing manslaughter even on one person, they get a jury trial. Martin Bryant was incarcerated. He said not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty 35 times in the court. About why? Do you have any idea why a jury trial wasn't instigated directly after that, as I believe it should have been?
Thank you.
John Avery, his legal representation took 14 or 15 visits over 17 days to convince Martin Bryant he had no other option but to plead guilty. John Avery also states, I think, he believed he also had to do the right thing by the community. In other words, John Avery was acting as a prosecutor. Martin Bryant had no legal representation. We were not permitted to have a trial in relation to Martin Bryant.
Thank you. Yes, your question.
Thank you.
Something that hasn't quite been touched on. I believe Martin had reasonable burns all up his back.
Back and buttocks, third-degree burns. That's all I'm aware of.
As far as I can understand, if you had supposedly set fire to the house or whatever, you know, you were going to incinerate yourself in it, or you were possibly either unconscious on the floor and all of a sudden realised I'm being burnt and got up and got out of there.
Thank you.
I've got problems how he was injured as well. I really don't know. But everything they tell us again falls into a big flat heap.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, your question.
Are you aware or have you heard of any connection with the school or the Department of Psychological Warfare?
That's John Rawlings Rees.
I've heard, I'm not sure where I heard it from, but there's a chap that rang me up shortly after this and told me a long story about Bryant having made regular trips to England for a year, over a year, and he'd stay there for a few days. He'd leave Tasmania with an overnight bag, be back a couple of days later, and he believed he was being psychologically prepared for this. And then the other thing that came out, and I'm not sure where I heard it, but his psychologist, whom he either went to America or an American psychologist came here, and he was asked at one stage, or that psychologist was asked for Bryant's record. That psychologist said, I'm sorry, I haven't got his record because my partner died, and the agreement was with most psychologists his records are destroyed, so mine were destroyed too. Now that psychologist, I was told, went to England and became the head of the psychological warfare department in, I don't know, NATO or England or somewhere, but it's pretty vague.
You know, what you're talking first of all about Dr. Cunningham Dax. Dr. Cunningham Dax went, I think it was about 84, when he interviewed Martin Bryant. The other doctor was Dr. Dix, who died, and all his notes were destroyed. Dr. Dix, I do believe, may have been associated with Tavistock. Cunningham Dax certainly was associated with Tavistock. Last one. Do you have anything else to cover? Anyone? I've only got this small, but for a little bit then. Right. Now let us consider the words of the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Tim Fischer, when he spoke to a group of professional shooters at Alice Springs in May 1996. If we don't get it right this time, the next time there is a massacre, and there will be, then they'll take all our guns off us. What Mr. Fischer is stating is that unless Australia brings in the required legislation, then Australia was going to suffer another massacre. The legislation was initiated and Australia has had no more massacres. The fact that many have ignored the new ideology-bound firearm laws and that firearms are still easily obtainable on a black market is irrelevant to these laws. However, what must also be considered is the comparison between the statement made by Tim Fischer and the then Premier of New South Wales, Barry Unsworth, back in December 1987, when he prophesied there will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania. He was quite right. After the massacre at Port Arthur, Australia did get a form of uniform gun laws, but not quite what Barry wanted. We should also consider the actions of the Australian Prime Minister up to and on the 10th of May 1996, when the new laws were implemented. The fact the 10th of May meeting had to make its decision in time for the evening news is straight out of a James Bond fictional scenario. Here is the 6 o'clock news. Big Ben chimed 3 times today at 2 o'clock, and the Australian Prime Minister, Mr John Howard, was successful in forcing the various states and territory police ministers into accepting his unconstitutional new guidelines for a total firearm control in Australia. Right? But there are other political ramifications regarding the uniform firearm laws in Australia. And Graham Richardson appeared on the Today Show about the 5th of May, after the Port Arthur massacre, and just prior to Mr Howard announcing his 10th of May meeting, and laid out the whole political scenario of why the Port Arthur massacre had to happen. Graham Richardson told us why it had to happen. Barry Unsworth had discovered, in his effort to retain the New South Wales government in 1988, that any government that moved into the area of gun control would lose power at the next election, be that state or federal. Again, because of the moves against the gun owners of Australia, there was a new political party born, and that party had to be destroyed before it gained too much strength within the political sphere. However, Graham Richardson gave out one further clue to demonstrate just what the push was regarding firearm control, and that was the shift of power from the states to Canberra. Graham Richardson stated that the easiest way for uniform firearm laws would be for the states to cede their constitutional powers in relation to firearms to the federal government. However, we are then informed that Premier Bob Carr had already initiated legislation in regard to ceding that power to the federal government. Now, this was before John Howard had announced his national guidelines policy, and it must be viewed as a ploy to have the Prime Minister adopt the full Labor Party policy in relation to gun control, a policy that emanated from the United Nations. What this demonstrates is that the moves for a total firearm control in Australia is based on that power being controlled by Canberra.